Fixing my neighbor's Wi-Fi began a spiral of secret photos, a letter revealing his truth, and the possibility Mr. Carver is my biofather. I've always been on good terms with my neighbor, Mr. Carver. He's one of those old-school, salt-of-the-earth types who can fix just about anything with a screwdriver and a roll of duct tape. In his late 60s, retired and always up for a chat, he's been a bit like a father figure to me, especially since I moved into the neighborhood a few years back. Whenever something broke around my place, like a leaky faucet or a door that wouldn't shut properly, he'd insist on helping out, refusing any form of payment beyond a cold beer and some good company. So when he knocked on my door a few weeks ago asking for a favor, it felt like a no-brainer to say yes. His problem? His internet was down, and he claimed to be as clueless as a fish out of water when it came to technology. He asked if I could take a look. I'm no IT genius, but I've set up my own Wi-Fi before, so I figured it wouldn't be too hard to troubleshoot. As I followed him into his house, I had no idea that this small favor was about to blow the lid off a secret that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about my family. And Mr. Carver. Fixing Mr. Carver's internet seemed straightforward enough. The router wasn't connecting because of a loose cable, so I swapped it out, restarted the system, and watched the blinking lights stabilize. Easy. While waiting for the reboot, Mr. Carver thanked me and said he'd run out to the store for some groceries. He trusted me enough to leave me alone in his house, which felt kind of nice, like I'd earned his respect over the years. As the router did his thing, I glanced around his dining room. That's when I noticed his laptop sitting open on the table. Normally I'd never snoop, but something about it caught my eye. The screen wasn't locked, and there was a folder on the desktop labeled for Jake. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, but I couldn't resist. Why would Mr. Carver have a folder with my name on it? Did he save articles for me? Some sort of thank you letter? Hesitantly, I clicked on it. Inside were dozens of photos. But not just any photos. These were pictures of my family, my parents, me, as a kid, at what looked like birthdays, backyard barbecues, and family outings. At first, I figured they might be old neighborhood snapshots, the kind you take at block parties. But they weren't. These photos were personal. Too personal. Some of them were taken long before I was even born, showing my parents as teenagers and young adults. Others featured me at events I barely remembered. And what really threw me off was that Mr. Carver wasn't in any of the pictures. They weren't his memories. So, how did he have them? Then I saw it. A single file in the folder entitled, The Truth. My pulse quickened as I hovered the cursor over the document. I knew I shouldn't open it. This was private. Clearly not something I was meant to find, but I couldn't stop myself. With one hesitant click, I opened the file. And just like that, my entire world started to unravel. The file opened, and as I started reading, my heart sank. It was a letter, addressed directly to me. At first, the tone was formal, almost detached, but soon the words shifted, becoming deeply personal and utterly devastating. In the letter, Mr. Carver admitted something I never saw coming. He explained that he had known my mom long before I was born. They had been high school sweethearts, and although their relationship ended, it hadn't completely stopped when she started dating my dad. He said their lives had overlapped in a way that made him question something monumental, whether he might actually be my biological father. I felt my pulse quicken as I kept reading. Mr. Carver wrote that he hadn't wanted to interfere with the life my mom had built with my dad. But as I grew up, he started seeing pieces of himself in me. In my features, in my mannerisms. That doubt, that lingering what if, had never left him. It was why he had stayed in the neighborhood all these years, to be near me, just in case. He ended the letter by apologizing, saying he didn't want to upend my life, but felt I had a right to know. If I ever wanted answers, he said he'd be there to tell me everything. I sat there, staring at the screen, unable to move. My mind raced with questions. Was this real? Did my mom know? Did my dad know? And if they didn't, what the hell was I supposed to do with this information? As I sat frozen, the sound of the front door opening jolted me back to reality. Mr. Carver was back, and I wasn't sure whether to confront him or run out of the house. The sound of the door closing snapped me out of my haze. I could hear Mr. Carver humming as he set the groceries down in the kitchen. My stomach churned. The letter was still open on the laptop in front of me, the words staring back at me like a dare. When he walked into the dining room and saw me, his cheerful expression then faltered. He looked at me, then at the laptop, and his face fell. It was clear he knew exactly what I'd found. I didn't waste time easing into it. I couldn't. The questions came spilling out. Why had he never told me? Did my mom know? How long had he suspected this? My voice shook, but I didn't care. Mr. Carver sighed, pulling out a chair and sitting across from me. He looked tired, like the weight of the secret had been wearing him down for years. He admitted that he'd suspected the truth for a long time, but never had any concrete proof. My mom had chosen to marry my dad, and Mr. Carver had decided not to interfere, thinking it was best for everyone involved. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked him why he thought I want to know now, after all these years, when it would only tear my family apart. His answer was simple but painful. He said I had a right to know who I really was. The anger bubbled up in me, and I told him this wasn't just about me. My dad, the man who had raised me, had no idea. This wasn't just a secret. It was a betrayal, one that could destroy everything. Mr. Carver didn't argue. He said he had thought about telling me countless times, but had always hesitated, fearing the damage it could do. Leaving the letter for me to find had been his way of finally coming clean, even if it was years too late. I couldn't sit there any longer. The room felt suffocating. I told him I needed time to process all of this and left without another word. As I walked back to my car, my mind swirled with a million thoughts. The life I thought I knew was crumbling around me, and I had no idea what to do next. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't keep this to myself. My mom had some serious explaining to do. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the words from the letter haunted me. The thought of my dad, my real dad, or at least the man I'd always believed was my dad, being left in the dark made my chest feel heavy. I knew I couldn't carry this alone, and I knew exactly who I needed answers from next. The next morning I drove to my parents' house. I didn't call ahead. I couldn't risk chickening out. My mom was surprised to see me, but welcomed me in, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd shared so many happy moments growing up, and I laid the truth out in front of her. I told her about helping Mr. Carver with his internet, about the folder with my name on it, and about the letter. I watched as her expression shifted from confusion to shock, then finally to something I couldn't quite place, maybe guilt. When I finished, the room was silent. I stared at her, waiting for her to deny it, to tell me that Mr. Carver was wrong, that none of this was true. But she didn't. Instead, her shoulders slumped, and she looked down at her hands. She admitted it, everything. She confirmed that she and Mr. Carver had been involved before she met my dad, and that their relationship had briefly overlapped. When she found out she was pregnant, she made a choice. My dad was stable, dependable, and the kind of man she wanted to build a life with. She decided to move forward with him and never looked back. Hearing her say it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. I asked her if my dad had any idea, if he'd ever suspected that I might not be his. She shook her head and said he didn't know. She had kept it a secret all these years, convinced it didn't matter, 'cause my dad loved me as his own. Her words didn't bring me any comfort. I told her she had taken away my choice to know who I really was. She had lied to my dad, to me, and to herself, all for the sake of keeping things easy for her. Her eyes welled with tears as she tried to apologize, but I couldn't bring myself to accept it. Not yet. Before I left, I told her I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but I couldn't promise to keep this secret. She begged me not to tell my dad, saying it would destroy him, but I walked out without giving her an answer. As I drove away, I realized the weight of the decisions ahead of me. No matter what I chose, someone was going to get hurt. But the truth was already out, and there was no turning back now. After confronting my mom, I couldn't shake the feeling that not telling my dad would be just another lie on top of everything else. He deserved to know the truth, no matter how painful it would be. Still, the thought of breaking his heart made me hesitate at every turn. For days I avoided my parents' calls and stayed holed up in my apartment, replaying scenarios in my mind. I'd imagine telling him, bracing for his reaction, and then I'd second-guess myself. But the longer I waited, the heavier the truth felt. Eventually I realized there was no good time, no perfect way to do this. I just had to rip the bandage off. I went to their house when I knew my mom wouldn't be there, and my dad greeted me like he always did, with a warm smile and a clap on the shoulder. Seeing him like that, so unsuspecting, nearly made me lose my nerve, but I had made my decision. We sat in the living room, and I asked him if we could talk. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat, but I forced them out. I told him about fixing Mr. Carver's internet, the folder with my name, the photos, and finally the letter. I explained that Mr. Carver believed he might be my biological father and that I had taken a DNA test to find out for sure. The look on my dad's face is something I'll never forget. It was a mix of confusion, pain, and disbelief, like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. For a moment he just stared at me, as if trying to make sense of what I was saying. I handed him the results of the test, and he read them in silence. When he looked back up at me, his expression was unreadable. I waited for anger, for hurt, for something, but all he said was that he needed a minute. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where we used to throw baseballs when I was a kid. I wanted to say something, to apologize, to take the pain away, but there was nothing I could say to make it better. Finally, he turned back to me. His voice was steady, but I could hear the strain in it. He said that no matter what the DNA test said, I was still his son. He had raised me, and nothing would change that. Hearing those words broke something in me. I hadn't realized how much I'd been bracing for rejection until it didn't come. But even in that moment, I could see the hurt behind his eyes. He asked if my mom knew, and I told him everything, how she had known all along but had chosen to keep it a secret. He didn't say much after that. He thanked me for telling him and said he needed time to figure out what to do next. I left the house feeling both relieved and devastated. I had done what I thought was right, but the fallout was just beginning. My dad now had to decide how to confront my mom, and I still had to figure out where Mr. Carver fit into all of this. The days after I told my dad were tense, like waiting for a storm to break. I avoided my parents' house, unsure of what was happening behind those closed doors. My mom called me several times, her voice frantic on the voicemail, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. She had betrayed my dad and me in ways I was still struggling to process. A week later, my dad called. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach churn. He asked me to come over, and when I arrived, the house felt eerily quiet. My parents were sitting together in the living room, but the distance between them was palpable. My dad wasted no time. He told me how he had confronted my mom, and she had admitted to everything. The affair, her doubts about my paternity, and the years of silence. He said he was furious at first, but more than anything, he felt hurt. Hurt that she had kept this secret, hurt that she had taken away his right to know the truth all those years ago. For the first time, I saw my dad truly vulnerable. He said he didn't know if he could forgive her, but wasn't sure if he could just walk away from their life together either. They had been married for decades, raised a family, and built a life. But now, it all felt tainted. My mom sat silently through all of this, her eyes red and swollen. When she finally spoke, it was to apologize again, but the words felt hollow. She kept saying she had acted out of love, that she had thought she was doing what was best for everyone, but neither my dad nor I could find much comfort in her reasoning. The conversation ended without resolution. My dad said he needed space, and my mom looked too broken to argue. I left the house feeling heavy, unsure if my family could ever recover from this. Meanwhile, there was still one more thread to pull on: Mr. Carver. I had avoided him since our last conversation, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my parents. He had been at the center of this secret, too, and I needed to figure out where he fit into my life now. After everything with my parents, I couldn't avoid Mr. Carver any longer. As much as I wanted to, I knew the truth wasn't going to disappear. He was my biological father, whether I liked it or not, and I needed to face him one more time. I decided to drop by his house unannounced. My hands were clammy as I walked up the steps to his front door. I hadn't spoken to him since the day I found the letter, and I wasn't sure what I was going to say. When he opened the door, his face was unreadable, somewhere between cautious and hopeful. He invited me in, and we sat at the same dining table where this entire mess had started. The silence stretched out between us before I finally broke it. I told him I had taken the DNA test and that it had confirmed what he had suspected all along. He was my biological father. Saying it out loud felt strange, like the words didn't belong to me. I didn't call him Dad or even Father. I just used his name, Mr. Carver, like I always had. He looked relieved but also hesitant, like he wasn't sure how I felt about him now. He thanked me for coming to see him and said he understood if I needed time to figure out what this meant for us. I didn't hold back. I told him how angry and confused I felt. I couldn't wrap my head around the fact that he had stayed in the background my entire life, knowing he might be my father but never stepping forward. He explained again that he didn't want to disrupt the life my mom had chosen. He had hoped she would tell me herself one day, but when she didn't, he decided to write the letter. His explanation didn't make me feel any better. I told him that his decision to stay silent had left me blindsided, and now I was stuck in the middle of a mess I hadn't created. He nodded, taking in everything I said without interrupting, which only made me feel worse. He didn't try to defend himself, didn't push for anything, and didn't even try to justify what he had done. He just listened. When I finally stopped talking, he said that he wasn't expecting anything from me. Not forgiveness, not a relationship, not even understanding. He said he just wanted me to know the truth because, in his heart, he couldn't leave this world without me knowing who I really was. Hearing him say that hit me harder than I expected. For all his mistakes, I could see that he genuinely cared, even if he had gone about things the wrong way. I left his house feeling emotionally drained, but with a faint sense of clarity. I wasn't ready to call him my father or even fully accept what this meant for my life, but I knew one thing. This wasn't over. The truth had changed everything, and now I had to figure out where to go from here. In the weeks that followed my meeting with Mr. Carver, life felt like I was walking a tightrope. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and my identity had shifted, and I didn't know where to plant my feet. I avoided my parents for a while, letting the dust settle between them. My dad called me occasionally, but the conversations were short, almost formal. I could tell he was trying to figure out how to handle things with my mom, and I didn't want to press him. My mom, on the other hand, sent text after text asking for forgiveness, begging to talk, and even trying to explain herself again. I wasn't ready to face her yet. And then there was Mr. Carver. For a while I ignored him too, not because I hated him, but because I didn't know what I wanted from him, or if I wanted anything at all. Every time I thought about seeing him, I felt this strange mix of anger, pity, and curiosity. He had stayed close to me for my entire life, quietly watching from the sidelines, but the years of silence still left a bitter taste in my mouth. One night I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, debating whether to call Mr. Carver or just let things fade. I thought about everything he had said, the regret in his voice, the way he hadn't tried to force anything. And I realized that despite everything, I didn't hate him. I was still angry, but there was a part of me that wanted to know more about him. About me. I called him, and we agreed to meet for coffee. It felt strange sitting across from him in such a casual setting, knowing what I knew now. He asked me how I was doing, and for once, I didn't sugarcoat it. I told him I was overwhelmed and didn't know how to process any of this. He listened, as he always did, and then he surprised me. He told me he wasn't asking for a relationship. He said he was proud of the life I had built and didn't want to disrupt it any further, but he also said he wanted to be honest about who he was, in case I ever wanted to know more. We talked for hours that day. He told me stories about his life, his work as an electrician, his younger years with my mom, and even little things, like his favorite hobbies and movies. I didn't ask many questions, but I appreciated that he didn't push. He gave me the space to come to terms with it all on my own terms. After that, I started seeing him occasionally, though I kept it to myself. It was still hard to think of him as anything more than my neighbor, but I couldn't deny that there was something there, something I was starting to explore. At the same time, my dad and I began to rebuild our relationship. One evening, I finally called him and asked if he wanted to grab dinner. We didn't talk about the DNA test or my mom that night. Instead, we talked about work, sports, and all the things we used to talk about before my world had flipped upside down. By the end of the night, I felt like I had my dad back, even if things would never quite be the same. As for my mom, that was more complicated. I wasn't ready to forgive her yet, but I also wasn't ready to shut her out completely. I needed time, and she seemed to understand that, finally giving me the space I had been asking for. Life didn't magically fix itself, but I started to see a path forward. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be. But for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. As weeks turned into months, I slowly began to adjust to my new reality. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of everything still felt suffocating. But I had learned to take things one step at a time, even when the road ahead felt uncertain. My dad and I started meeting regularly, grabbing dinner or catching a game together like we used to. He never brought up the DNA results again, and neither did I. He didn't need to remind me that he was my real dad in every way that mattered. His actions had always spoken louder than any test could. I could see that he was still hurting, especially when it came to my mom, but he handled it with the quiet strength he'd always had. My relationship with my mom, though, remained rocky. She continued to apologize, sending me long texts and leaving messages. I knew she was trying, but Every time I thought about the years of lies, I felt the anger rise all over again. I did eventually agree to meet with her. It wasn't a reconciliation so much as a tentative step forward. I told her I needed time and that forgiveness, if it came, would not be on her timeline. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and promised to be patient. Then there was Mr. Carver. Our conversations became more frequent, though I still kept him at arm's length. I didn't know what to call him or how to define our relationship. He wasn't my dad in the way I thought of the man who raised me, but he wasn't just my neighbor anymore either. He was careful not to overstep, never asking for more than I was willing to give. One day he showed me some old photos of him and my mom when they were teenagers. They looked so happy, so carefree. It was strange, seeing a version of her I had never known. He even pointed out how much I resembled him at that age. Something I couldn't deny. For the first time, I started to see pieces of myself in him, and it didn't feel as strange as it once did. But the biggest moment of clarity came when my dad, Mr. Carver, and I all crossed paths unexpectedly. I had invited my dad to a local event, not knowing Mr. Carver would also be there. When we ran into each other, the tension was thick. I introduced them awkwardly, unsure of how either would react. To my surprise, my dad extended his hand and thanked Mr. Carver for staying out of the way all those years. Mr. Carver, in turn, expressed his respect for the way my dad had raised me. It was a brief exchange, but it felt monumental. For the first time, I felt like the three of us could coexist without tearing each other apart. In time, I found a balance between the different pieces of my life. My dad remained the man I leaned on most, my rock through everything. Mr. Carver became someone I could talk to about parts of myself I was still discovering. And my mom, well, our relationship was still a work in progress. The truth had changed everything, but it didn't destroy me. If anything, it made me realize that family isn't about perfection. It's about finding a way forward, even when the path is messy and complicated.